A ruthless billionaire lost in a storm. A humble family with nothing to give, except kindness. When William Harrington stumbles into the Dawson home, he finds more than shelter. He finds the truth about wealth, love, and a past that refuses to stay buried. But will it cost him everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Thunder crashed across the sky as William Harrington gripped his steering wheel tighter. Rain poured down so hard he could barely see the road ahead. His sleek black Mercedes, worth more than most people's homes, crawled along the dark country road. He shouldn't have taken this shortcut, but he was desperate to get away from another boring charity dinner where people only cared about showing off their wealth. Come on, he muttered, squinting through the windshield. The GPS had stopped working miles ago and his phone was dead. Just his luck. He was William Harrington, one of the richest men in the state, and here he was, lost in the middle of nowhere during the worst storm of the year. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and William saw it too late. A fallen tree, branch right in his path. He swerved hard and the car spun out of control. The world turned upside down as the Mercedes slid off the road and into a ditch with a sickening crunch. William sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. He wasn't hurt, thank goodness, but the car wasn't going anywhere. The engine made a pitiful, whining sound when he tried to start it. Just perfect, he said, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. He was 55 years old, and in all his years of building his real estate empire, he'd never felt so helpless. Through the rain-streaked windows, he spotted something, a tiny light in the distance. It had to be a house. William grabbed his wallet and jacket, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked him instantly. His Italian leather shoes sank into the mud as he trudged toward the light. As he got closer, his heart sank. It wasn't the nice farmhouse he'd hoped for. Instead, he found himself staring at a small, run-down cottage that had definitely seen better days. The porch sagged in the middle. Paint peeled from the walls, but warm light spilled from the windows, and through the sound of rain he could hear children's laughter inside. William hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from people who lived like this. But another crack of thunder made up his mind. He climbed the creaky steps and knocked on the door. The door opened, and William found himself face to face with a woman in her early 40s. She had kind eyes and wore a simple dress that had been mended more than once. Behind her, 3 children peeked out curiously. 2 boys and a girl, all under 12 from the look of them. "Oh my goodness," the woman said, taking in his drenched appearance. "Please come in, no one should be out in weather like this." Thank you," William said, surprised by the immediate offer of help. "My car went off the road about a quarter-mile back. I hate to impose, but my phone's dead, and I need to call for help." "Our landline's out because of the storm," the woman said, ushering him inside. "I'm Margaret Dawson, and these are my children, Tommy, Sarah, and little Jack. James, we have a visitor." A tall man appeared from what looked like the kitchen, drying his hands on a worn dish towel. Despite the shabbiness of his clothes, he carried himself with dignity. "James Dawson," he said, offering his hand. "Looks like the storm caught you good." William introduced himself simply as Will, leaving off his last name. He'd learned long ago that people acted differently when they knew who he really was. The inside of the cottage was as humble as the outside, but it was clean and warm. A fire crackled in a small fireplace, and the furniture, though old, had been carefully maintained. William noticed patches in the curtains and a leak in one corner where pots had been placed to catch drips. "You must be freezing," Margaret said. "James, lend him some dry clothes. I'll make some hot coffee." "Oh, I couldn't." William started to protest, but James was already heading to their bedroom. "Nonsense," Margaret called from the kitchen. "We don't have much, but what we have, we share. That's what Mama always taught me." William found himself being handed clean, if well-worn, clothes. The children showed him to their tiny bathroom to change. When he came out, wearing James's spare shirt and pants that were a little too long, the smell of coffee filled the air. Margaret had set out cups on a coffee table that had seen better days. Next to them was a plate with what looked like the last few slices of bread, carefully toasted. "I'm sorry we don't have more to offer," Margaret said, a slight blush on her cheeks. "It's been a tight month." "Please," William said, genuinely touched. "You've already done more than enough." As he sat there, sipping coffee that was actually better than what his expensive coffee maker produced at home, William found himself drawn into conversation with the family. The children, instead of being shooed away to bed, were allowed to stay up and listen. "Daddy," little Sarah asked, "can you tell the story about the angel again?" James laughed. "Your favorite, huh? Well, it was a night just like this, about 5 years ago." And so William learned their story. James had been a construction worker until an accident left him with a bad back. He could only work odd jobs now. Margaret cleaned houses and did whatever work she could find. They were behind on their rent, and the bank was threatening to take their little cottage. But not once did they complain. Instead, they talked about their blessings, having each other, the garden where they grew vegetables, the kindness of neighbors who sometimes shared what they had. "We get by," James said simply. "The Lord provides." William sat there, stunned. In his world, people schemed and complained even with millions in the bank. Yet here was a family who had almost nothing, sharing their last bits of food with a stranger. The May storm raged on outside, but inside that tiny cottage, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The children's laughter. The way Margaret and James looked at each other with love despite their hardships. The simple kindness they showed to a stranger. It all touched something deep inside him. As the night wore on, Margaret made up the couch, for him with their best blankets, which were still worn thin. The children insisted on singing their favorite song before bed, their sweet voices rising above the storm. Lying there in the dark, listening to the rain and the occasional creak of the old house, William made a decision. He'd been looking for something for years, searching for it in business deals and charity galas, and here in this broken-down cottage with a leaky roof, he'd finally found it. He'd found real wealth. The sun rose the next morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. William woke early, used to his busy schedule. He found Margaret already up, trying to make breakfast from nearly empty cupboards. "I'm sorry we don't have much for breakfast," she said softly, not wanting to wake the others. "But I can make you some tea, please," William said, reaching for his wallet. "Let me help." No, Margaret said firmly. "You're our guest." William watched as she stretched a few eggs and the last bit of bread to somehow make enough for everyone. The children came bouncing in, full of energy despite their circumstances. James followed more slowly, his back clearly giving him trouble. The "Storm's cleared," James said, looking out the window. "I can drive you to town to get help for your car." "Actually," William said, "I need to tell you something first." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he took out a business card, one he usually saved for important meetings. He handed it to James. James's eyes widened as he read it. William Harrington, the real estate developer. Margaret nearly dropped the tea she was serving. The children looked confused. "Yes," William said simply. "And I have a story to tell you too, about a little boy who lived in a cottage, not much different from this one, with a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table." He told them about growing up poor, about his mother who never lost her kindness despite their hardships. How one night, during a storm much like last night's, she took in a stranded traveler who turned out to be the man who would later give young William his first job in real estate. "I've spent years building my fortune," William said, "but somewhere along the way I forgot what real wealth looks like. Last night you reminded me." He pulled out his checkbook. Not the normal one he used for everyday expenses, but the special one, the one linked to his private account, the one he used for life-changing amounts. "This isn't charity," he said firmly, writing out a number that made Margaret gasp when she saw it. "This is an investment in kindness, the kind of kindness my mother showed, the kind you showed me last night." James tried to protest, but William held up his hand. "The world needs more people like you. Use this to fix up the cottage, to give these wonderful children the education they deserve. And I have a job offer for you, James, not out of pity, but because I need honest people in my company, people who understand the value of hard work and kindness." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. The children, understanding something important was happening, hugged their parents. "Why us?" James asked, his voice shaking. Out of all the people in the world, why did you end up at our door last night? William smiled, remembering his mother's words from long ago. Sometimes, James, angels don't have wings. Sometimes they wear old work boots and share their last piece of bread with a stranger. But this was just the beginning. What William didn't know was that his act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only the Dawsons' lives, but his own, in ways he never could have imagined. Because sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as storms, and the greatest blessings wear humble clothes. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. The Dawsons, those nice people who lived in the old cottage on Miller's Road, had suddenly come into money. Some said they'd won the lottery. Others whispered about a mysterious benefactor. Nobody knew the whole truth except the family themselves. Margaret insisted on going to work that Monday, despite the check sitting in their old cookie jar. "These people depend on me," she said, heading off to clean houses like she always had. But now she carried a secret joy in her heart, knowing their struggles were finally ending. William didn't just write a check and disappear. He sent contractors to look at the cottage, good ones who understood the importance of preserving its charm while fixing what needed fixing. The leaky roof, the sagging porch, the drafty windows, all would be repaired. But not everyone was happy about the Dawsons' sudden change in fortune. Vera Patterson, the wealthy widow who owned half the rental properties in town, including the Dawsons' cottage, showed up one morning in her expensive car. "I hear you've come into some money," she said, eyeing the contractors measuring the porch. "Well, isn't that convenient? Just when I was about to evict you for being 3 months behind on rent." "We can pay what we owe," James said quietly. "With interest." "Oh, it's not about the money anymore," Vera said with a cold smile. "I've decided to sell this property. You have 30 days to move out." What Vera didn't know was that William had anticipated something like this. He'd already started looking into property records and local real estate dealings. What he found worried him. "She's been forcing people out of their homes," he told James over the phone, "buying up property cheap and flipping it for huge profits. She doesn't care who gets hurt in the process." Like what happened to the Hendersons last year, James said, remembering how their elderly neighbors had been forced out of their home of 40 years. They had to move in with their daughter in Florida. "Well, not this time," William said firmly. "I didn't get where I am by letting bullies win." But Vera Patterson had friends in high places. The town council members played golf at her country club. The local bank president was her cousin. She'd spent years building her influence, and she wasn't about to let some out-of-town billionaire interfere with her plans. Meanwhile, the Dawson children were experiencing their own changes. At school, kids who had never noticed them before suddenly wanted to be their friends. Tommy, the oldest at 12, came home upset one day. "Billy Thompson says we think we're better than everyone else now," he told his mother. "But we're not different, are we, Mum?" Margaret sat him down at their old kitchen table. "Money doesn't make us better or worse than anyone else, Tommy. What matters is how we treat people. Remember how Mr. Harrington could have looked down on us that night? But he didn't. That's the kind of people we want to be." James started his new job at Harrington Enterprises, working in the Community Relations Department. William had recognized something in James, an ability to connect with people, to understand their needs. It wasn't charity, it was smart business. But Vera Patterson wasn't done. She started spreading rumors about the Dawsons, how they must have done something illegal to get their money, how Margaret had always acted above her station, cleaning houses but dreaming of better things. "Don't listen to them," William advised when James called him, worried about the rumors. "People like Vera Patterson can't understand kindness without ulterior motives because they've never shown real kindness themselves." The contractors continued their work on the cottage, transforming it day by day, but they kept its heart. The crooked window in Sarah's room that made rainbow patterns on the wall, the height marks on the kitchen doorframe showing how the children had grown. One evening, as Margaret worked in their small garden, she insisted on keeping it even though they could now afford to buy vegetables. She found an old woman standing at their gate. "I'm Clara Henderson," the woman said. "I used to live in the blue house down the road before Mrs. Patterson forced us out." Margaret invited her in for tea, and Clara told her story. How Vera Patterson had used similar tactics with many families over the years. How she'd gradually been buying up the whole neighborhood piece by piece. But nobody ever stood up to her, Clara said, her hands shaking slightly as she held her teacup. Nobody could afford to. That night, after the children were in bed, James and Margaret sat on their porch swing, the same one James had built when they first moved in, now freshly painted. "We have to do something," Margaret said. "Not just for us, but for everyone Vera Patterson has hurt." James nodded, thinking about everything William had taught him about real estate and community development. "Maybe," he said slowly, "this is why Mr. Harrington really ended up at our door that night. Not just to help us, but to help make things right. They didn't know it yet, but they were right." The storm that had brought William Harrington to their door was nothing compared to the storm of change about to sweep through their small town. And at the center of it all was a family who had never lost their kindness, even when they had nothing else to give. While the Dawsons dealt with Vera Patterson's threats, William faced his own struggles back in the city. His sudden interest in a small-town property dispute had caught the attention of his board of directors, particularly his younger brother, Richard. "What are you doing, William?" Richard demanded during a tense board meeting. "Since when do you care about some rundown cottage in the middle of nowhere?" William looked around the luxurious conference room at the faces of people who'd never known what it was like to worry about their next meal. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the best investments aren't about money." But Richard wasn't satisfied. He'd always lived in William's shadow, always second best, and he'd been waiting for years to prove that his older brother was losing his touch. After the meeting, William's secretary handed him a thick folder. "The background check you requested on Vera Patterson," she said. William spent the evening in his penthouse office, reading through the documents. What he found made his blood run cold. 20 years ago, Vera Patterson had been involved in a similar scheme in another town. She'd forced dozens of families out of their homes, but one family had fought back, the Turners. They'd taken her to court, had evidence of her illegal dealings, but the night before the trial, their house mysteriously burned down, destroying all their evidence. The case was dismissed. The Turners disappeared after that. Some said they moved to California. Others whispered darker theories. But what caught William's attention was the Turners' daughter's name, Margaret. "Margaret Turner," William whispered, staring at the old newspaper photo. The young girl in the grainy picture had the same kind eyes as Margaret Dawson. His phone rang, making him jump. It was James. "Mr. Harrington," James said, his voice tense. "Someone broke into our cottage tonight. They didn't take anything, but they went through all our old papers." William's grip tightened on the phone. "Are Margaret and the children okay?" "They're fine. We were all at church when it happened." "But Mr. Harrington, Margaret's acting strange. When the police asked if we had any enemies, she went pale and wouldn't answer." "James," William said carefully, "has Margaret ever talked about her family? About what happened before you met her?" There was a long pause. "No," James said finally. "She always said they died in a house fire. She doesn't like talking about it." William closed his eyes. The pieces were falling into place. "I think it's time I paid another visit to your town. And James, don't let Margaret out of your sight. The past is catching up with all of us." Margaret couldn't sleep that night. After the break-in, after the police questions, the memories she'd buried for 20 years came flooding back. She sat at the kitchen table, holding an old locket, the only thing she had left from her previous life. Inside was a faded photo of her parents smiling, unaware of the tragedy that would destroy their lives. James found her there at midnight. "Talk to me, Maggie," he said softly, using the nickname he saved for their most private moments. "What's really going on?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "My real name is Margaret Turner," she said, opening the locket. "And Vera Patterson is the woman who destroyed my family." She told him everything. About growing up in another small town, about her father discovering Vera's illegal schemes, about the night their house burned down. "We lost everything," she whispered. "The evidence, our home, our whole lives." Dad was never the same after that. He blamed himself. 6 months later, he had a heart attack. Mom followed a year after that. James held her as she cried. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared. I changed my name, moved here, tried to start fresh. When I met you, it was like God was giving me a second chance at happiness. I thought the past was behind me." She wiped her eyes. "But now, Vera's found me, and she'll destroy us just like she destroyed my family." "No," James said firmly. "Not this time. You're not alone anymore." The next morning, William arrived in town. He called an emergency meeting at the local diner. James, Margaret, and Clara Henderson, who'd been keeping records of Vera's dealings for years. "We have a chance to stop her," William said, spreading out documents on the table. "But we need evidence, real evidence that will stand up in court." Clara pulled out a worn notebook. "I've been writing everything down. Dates, times, names, people she's forced out, properties she's flipped illegally." Margaret stared at the notebook. "Just like my father did," she said softly. William looked at her kindly. "History doesn't have to repeat itself, Margaret. This time you have people on your side, people with the power to fight back, but they didn't know they were being watched." In a corner booth, a man in a dark suit made a phone call. "Mrs. Patterson, they're planning something." And you were right. Margaret Dawson is really Margaret Turner. Vera Patterson hung up the phone in her mansion and smiled coldly. "So, the little girl came back," she said to herself. "Well, this time I'll make sure she loses everything for good." The next few days brought a wave of strange incidents. First, James's new office at Harrington Enterprises was broken into, though nothing seemed missing. Then Tommy came home from school crying because someone had spread rumors that his family was involved in drug dealing. Even their contractor suddenly quit, claiming he'd received threats. "She's trying to isolate us," Margaret said, pacing in their half-renovated living room, "just like she did to my parents." William called an emergency meeting at his hotel suite. This time they were joined by Sarah Miller, a young reporter from the local newspaper who'd been investigating Vera Patterson for months. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading photos across the coffee table. They showed Vera meeting with various town officials in secret locations. She's got half the town council in her pocket. Building permits that should take months get approved. In days, health violations mysteriously disappear. Clara Henderson nodded. "That's how she forced us out. Suddenly our house had all these code violations we'd never had before." William studied the photos. "We need more than just suspicions. We need proof of actual crimes." "I might have something," James said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "In my new position at Harrington Enterprises, I've been reviewing local property records. There's a pattern. Every time Vera forces someone out, the property gets sold to one of 5 different companies. I did some digging. They're all shell corporations registered to an address in the Cayman Islands." William leaned forward. "Money laundering," he said. "She's not just flipping properties. She's cleaning dirty money through real estate deals." Margaret gasped. "That's what my father discovered all those years ago, but all his evidence burned in the fire that was never properly investigated," Sarah added, pulling out more papers. "I found the original police report, the investigator who ruled it an accident. His kid's college tuition was paid for by an anonymous donor the next year." Suddenly, Margaret sat up straight. "The notebook," she said. "My father's notebook. He always carried it with him, kept all his evidence there. But the night of the fire, he'd left it at his office. The next day when he went to get it, it was gone. We always assumed Vera's people took it." "What if they didn't?" William asked. "What if somebody else found it? Somebody who's been waiting for the right time to use it?" Just then, William's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Interested in the truth about Vera Patterson? Meet me at St. Mary's Church. Midnight. Come alone." William showed them the message. "It could be a trap," James warned. "Or it could be the break we need," William replied. He looked at Margaret. "Your father was brave enough to stand up to her. Now it's our turn." But even as they made plans, other wheels were turning. In her mansion, Vera Patterson was meeting with Richard Harrington, William's younger brother. "Your brother's becoming a problem," Vera said, sipping expensive whiskey. "He's sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." Richard swirled his drink. "William always had a weakness for sob stories. But if he exposes your operation, he'll expose yours too," Vera finished. "All those properties you helped me flip through your offshore accounts. All that money you made looking the other way. Richard set his glass down hard. What do you want me to do? Vera smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tonight your brother's going to get a message about meeting someone at St. Mary's Church. Make sure he never makes it there. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, Margaret was tucking her children into bed when Tommy asked a question that made her freeze. Mom, is it true what Billy Thompson's dad said? That you're not really who you say you are? Margaret sat on the edge of his bed, her heart heavy. Sometimes, sweetheart, people have to hide who they are to stay safe. But that doesn't make them bad people. Like superheroes? Tommy asked. Margaret smiled through her tears. Something like that. But remember, no matter what anyone says, the most important thing is that we stick together as a family. Can you be brave for me? Tommy nodded solemnly. Like Dad says, we're Dawsons, we don't give up. Outside Tommy's window, storm clouds were gathering again. But this storm wouldn't just bring rain, it would bring revelations that would change their town forever. As midnight approached, William prepared to leave for St. Mary's Church. But someone was watching from the shadows, waiting to make sure this meeting never happened. And in her mansion, Vera Patterson opened an old safe behind a painting, pulling out a familiar notebook, one that hadn't burned in a fire 20 years. Ago, but had been kept as insurance against the day someone might try to expose her secrets. The old church stood dark against the night sky, its steeple reaching up like a finger pointing to heaven. William parked his car a block away, his headlights off. Years of business deals had taught him to be careful, but something about this felt different, more dangerous. He didn't notice the other car parked in the shadows, or his brother Richard watching him with troubled eyes. Richard's hand tightened on his steering wheel. "I'm sorry, William," he whispered, "but I can't let you ruin everything." Inside the church, the moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on the empty pews. William's footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. "Hello?" he called out, softly. "I'm here about Vera Patterson." A figure stepped out from behind a pillar. William squinted in the darkness. Then his eyes widened in surprise. It was Martha Stevens, Vera's personal secretary for the last 30 years. "I've been watching," Martha said, her voice shaking. "All these years watching her destroy people's lives. I can't do it anymore." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is everything. Bank records, offshore accounts, proof of bribes. She doesn't know I've been copying documents for years." Just then, they heard a car door slam outside. Martha's face went pale. "She followed me. Oh God, she followed me." William grabbed her arm. "The back door, quickly." But as they turned to run, Richard appeared in the doorway holding something in his hand. The moonlight glinted off the metal of a gun. "Give me the envelope, William," Richard said, his voice strained. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." "Richard?" William stared at his brother in disbelief. "You're working with her." "Working with her?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I've been helping her for years, all those times you passed me over for promotions, treated me like I wasn't good enough. Vera saw my potential. She helped me set up my own deals. I'm not just your little brother anymore." "Those deals were illegal," Martha said. "You helped her force people from their homes." "Shut up." Richard's hand shook. "Nobody was supposed to get hurt. It was just business." "Just business?" A new voice echoed through the church. Margaret stepped out from behind a pillar, followed by James and Sarah Miller, the reporter. They had followed William, worried about the mysterious message. "Was it just business when you burned down my family's home?" Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. "When you destroyed my father's life?" Richard's face went pale. I wasn't part of that." "But you knew about it," William said quietly. "Didn't you? You knew what kind of person you were working with." Suddenly, the church doors burst open. Vera Patterson strode in, followed by two men in dark suits. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "A midnight reunion. Martha, dear, I'm so disappointed in you." Martha clutched the envelope tighter. "I won't let you hurt any more people." "Hurt people?" Vera laughed. "I made this town what it is. I took rundown properties and turned them into something valuable. If some people had to leave, well, that's progress." "Progress?" Margaret stepped forward. You destroyed families, you ruined lives. And who's going to believe you? Vera smirked. The woman living under a false name? The cleaning lady playing at being respectable? They'll believe this, came another voice. Everyone turned to see Tommy standing in the doorway holding up his phone. I've been recording everything, and I already sent it to all my friends' parents. Behind Tommy stood Clara Henderson and a group of townspeople, all the families Vera had hurt over the years. They had followed after Tommy ran out of the house. It's over, Vera, William said. The truth is finally coming out. Richard looked at his brother, then at Vera, then slowly lowered his gun. He's right, he said quietly. It's over. But Vera wasn't done. She pulled out a familiar notebook, the one that had disappeared the night of the fire 20 years ago. You want the truth? She snarled. Here it is, your father's precious evidence. I kept it all these years just in case. You want to know what really happened that night. But before she could continue, police sirens wailed in the distance. Sarah Miller smiled. I called them 10 minutes ago, and I've been recording this whole conversation too. Real reporters always have backup. Vera's face contorted with rage. She turned to run, but James moved quickly, blocking her path. The notebook fell from her hands, and Margaret caught it, holding it close to her heart. Daddy, she whispered. We did it. We finally did it. As the police cars pulled up outside, lighting up the stained glass windows with flashing blue and red, William looked at his brother. We need to talk, he said softly. About everything. Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, William. I was so angry, so jealous, I let it poison everything. Tommy ran to his mother, hugging her tight. Are we safe now, Mom? Margaret held her son, watching as the police led Vera and her men away. Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. And we can finally be ourselves again. But even as dawn approached and the truth came to light, nobody realized that this night would set in motion events that would change their lives in ways they never could have imagined. Because some secrets, once revealed, have a way of leading to even bigger revelations. The morning after the church confrontation, the small town was buzzing with news. Police cars surrounded Vera Patterson's mansion. Reporters from big city newspapers crowded the streets. But in the Dawsons' cottage, a different kind of revelation was taking place. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her father's notebook open in front of her. Her hands trembled as she read his familiar handwriting. James stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, offering silent support. He knew, Margaret whispered. Daddy knew even more than we thought. Look at these names. Judges, politicians, business leaders. Vera's network went so much deeper than just our town. The doorbell rang, making them jump. It was William, looking tired but determined. Behind him stood Richard, his eyes red from a sleepless night. May we come in? William asked. Margaret nodded, though she couldn't help tensing at Richard's presence. They all sat around the kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the windows. The police found documents at Vera's house, William explained. She wasn't just forcing people out of their homes here. She was doing it in towns all across the state. Richard's been up all night, telling them everything he knows. Richard couldn't meet Margaret's eyes. I never knew about the fire, he said, quietly. I swear, when I found out, I should have done something then, but I was already in too deep. Why? James asked. Why did you help her at all? Richard's laugh was bitter. Because I wanted to prove I could be as successful as William. Every time he made a deal, closed a project, I felt smaller. Vera offered me a chance to make my own fortune. I didn't want to know where the money really came from. The money, William said, pulling out some papers. That's actually why we're here. Richard's been working with our lawyers all night. He's signing over everything he made from Vera's schemes, all the properties, all the profits. We want to use it to help the families she hurt. Margaret stared at the papers. The amount of money was staggering. All of it? All of it, Richard nodded. It won't make up for what happened, but maybe it can help make things right. Just then, Tommy came running in from outside. Mom, Dad, you have to see this. They all followed him to the front yard. The street was filled with people, dozens of families, some they knew, some they'd never met. Clara Henderson stood at the IOE front. These are families from other towns, Clara explained. People Vera hurt over the years. When they heard what happened, they came to tell their stories. An elderly man stepped forward. I lost my farm to her schemes 10 years ago, he said. Been too ashamed to talk about it until now. One by one, people began to share their stories. Tales of lost homes, broken dreams, lives turned upside down by Vera's greed. But now, finally, they could speak the truth. Sarah Miller moved through the crowd, recording everything on her phone. This is bigger than just one story, she said. This is about all the small towns where rich people think they can push around anyone they want. Inside, the phone started ringing. It was the governor's office. The story had reached the state capital, and there would be a full investigation into corruption in small-town real estate dealings. Margaret went back to the kitchen and picked up her father's notebook. Daddy kept fighting, she said softly, even when it seemed hopeless. He knew someday the truth would come out. William looked at his brother. We need to make this right. Not just here, but everywhere Vera caused harm. Richard nodded. I'll testify. About everything. Maybe that's how I start making up for what I did. Tommy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, now that everyone knows who you really are, do we have to change our name back to Turner? Margaret hugged her son tight. No, sweetheart, I'm proud to be Margaret Dawson. Your father and you kids, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Being a Dawson isn't just a name, it's who I am now. James wrapped his arms around his family. Besides, he said with a smile, Dawsons don't run from the truth. We stand and fight for what's right. Outside, more people were arriving. The street was filled with cars. News vans were setting up their equipment. This small-town story was about to become national news, but in the cottage's kitchen, something more important was happening. Healing was beginning. Richard and William sat together, really talking for the first time in years. Margaret held her father's notebook, finally able to fulfill his legacy. And James watched it all, amazed at how a single storm-filled night had led to all of this. Sarah Miller came back inside, her eyes bright with excitement. You won't believe who just called me, she said. 60 Minutes wants to do a story. They want to interview everyone. About Vera, about the corruption, about how a small town finally stood up to the rich and powerful. Not just a small town, William corrected. A family, because that's what we've all become through this, haven't we? Margaret looked around her kitchen, at her husband and children, at William who had changed their lives that stormy night, even at Richard who was trying to make amends. She thought about all the people outside, brought together by shared pain but now finding strength in unity. Yes, she said, a family, and families protect each other. But even as they celebrated this moment of triumph, none of them could have guessed that the biggest revelation was still to come. Because in Vera Patterson's mansion, the police were about to find something that would shake their world all over again. Detective Lisa Martinez stood in Vera Patterson's study, staring at the hidden safe they'd just opened behind a painting. But it wasn't money or jewels that caught her attention. It was a stack of old letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Get William Harrington here, she said to her partner. Now. An hour later, William walked into the mansion, followed by Richard. The detective handed him the first letter. As William read, his face went pale. This can't be right, he whispered. What is it? Richard asked, concerned by his brother's reaction. William looked up, his hands shaking. These letters are from our mother. Back at the cottage, Margaret was helping the children get ready for school when James rushed in, his phone in hand. You need to come to Vera's mansion, he said urgently. William just called. They found something big. When they arrived, they found William sitting in Vera's study, letters spread out on the antique desk. Richard stood by the window, his face a mask of shock. Our mother, William said without looking up, worked for Vera Patterson 30 years ago, before Richard and I got rich, when we were just poor kids with a single mum. She was Vera's housekeeper. Margaret sat down hard in a leather chair. But what does that mean? It means, William continued, that the night I ended up at your cottage wasn't an accident. Our mother knew Vera's secrets. She knew what kind of person Vera really was. These letters, she was gathering evidence, just like your father did. Margaret. But the accident, Richard said, his voice hollow. The car crash that killed her. Detective Martinez stepped forward. We found something else. Bank records from that time. The mechanic who worked on your mother's car the day before her accident, he received a very large payment from one of Vera's shell companies. The room went silent. Finally, William spoke, his voice thick with emotion. She murdered our mother, and then she spent years using me, using my success, to make herself look respectable. Every charity dinner, every business deal, it was all just a cover. And me, Richard whispered. She knew who I was when she approached me. She wasn't just using my jealousy, she was playing some kind of sick game with both of us. Margaret reached out and touched William's hand. Your mother was trying to stop her, just like my father. They were both heroes. James looked through the letters. There's more, he said. Look at the dates. Your mother was working with someone else, someone who was supposed to expose everything if anything happened to her. But who? William asked. Just then they heard a commotion outside. Martha Stevens, Vera's secretary, was trying to get past the police tape. When they let her through, she was carrying an old briefcase I promised her, Martha said, tears in her eyes. Your mother, she made me promise to keep these safe, to wait until the time was right. When I saw what was happening with the Dawsons, with Margaret's story coming out, I knew it was finally time. She opened the briefcase. Inside were photographs, documents, recordings, 30 years of evidence against Vera Patterson. Your mother knew she was in danger, Martha explained. She gave me everything the night before the accident, made me swear to protect it and to watch over her boys from a distance. William stared at the woman who had been Vera's secretary all these years. You've been watching us all this time? Martha nodded. Making sure you were safe. Making sure. Vera didn't hurt you too. Your mother was my best friend. We worked together, figured out what Vera was doing when she died. I took the job as Vera's secretary, kept gathering evidence, year after year, waiting for the right moment. Richard sank into a chair. All these years, we thought we were alone, but you were there, protecting us. Your mother asked me to look out for you boys, Martha said simply, and Helen Harrington was not a woman. You said no to. Margaret squeezed James's hand. So that night, when William's car broke down near our cottage, Martha smiled sadly. I might have mentioned to him earlier that day that the back roads were a good shortcut. I knew about you. Margaret knew your story. When I saw William starting to question things, starting to remember the kind person he used to be, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was time for all these secrets to come out. William stood up, walking to the window. Outside, reporters were gathering, drawn by rumors of new revelations in the Patterson case. Mom never gave up, he said quietly. She fought to the end, trying to protect people. And now we can finish what she started. What do you mean? Richard asked. William turned, his eyes fierce with purpose. I mean, we use everything, the evidence, the money, our influence, to help every single person Vera ever hurt. We make it right. All of it. James nodded. The Dawsons will help, every step of the way. Margaret picked up one of William's mother's letters. Our parents never met, she said softly, but they were fighting the same battle. And now their children will fight it together. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in their small town, but this sunset felt different, like it was ending not just a day, but an era of secrets and pain. As they left the mansion, William looked at Martha. Thank you, he said, for keeping your promise to our mother, for watching over us. Martha smiled, tears in her eyes. Helen would be so proud of both her boys. Even when you were lost, Richard, she never stopped loving you, never stopped believing you'd find your way back. But even as they walked out into the gathering dusk, none of them realized that this revelation would lead to one final earth-shattering discovery. Because Vera Patterson had one last secret, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their connected histories. The next morning, Detective Martinez called William with news that made his blood run cold. They needed him at the police station immediately. When he arrived, he found Margaret and her family already there, along with Martha Stevens. "We found this in a hidden compartment in Vera's bedroom floor," Detective Martinez said, placing an old leather diary on the table. "It's Vera's personal journal, and what's inside? Well, you need to read it yourselves." William opened a diary, Margaret looking over his shoulder. "The first entry was dated 40 years ago. I saw him again today," the entry began. "Charles Patterson, my husband, meeting secretly with that woman, Helen McCarthy." William's head snapped up. "McCarthy? That was our mother's maiden name." Margaret kept reading, her voice shaking. "He thinks I don't know about their child, the baby they gave up for adoption before he married me, before I trapped him with my money and my threats." The room went dead silent. Martha's face had gone white. "Helen McCarthy," Martha whispered. "She never told you boys. She never told anyone except me. Before she married your father, before you were born, she had another baby. A little girl she had to give up." Margaret's hands were trembling, so hard she could barely turn the page. The next entry made her gasp. "I've found the child. After all these years, I finally found her. She was adopted by the Turners. Margaret Turner, the same Margaret Turner who's been causing me so much trouble. Charles Patterson's daughter, my husband's daughter, has been fighting against me all this time without even knowing who she really is." "No," Margaret whispered. "No, that's not possible." But it was. The diary laid it all out. How Vera had discovered that her husband had a child with Helen McCarthy before their marriage. How she'd used her money and influence to force Helen to give up the baby. How she'd tracked down that child years later, only to find her grown up, married to James Dawson, fighting against Vera's corrupt empire. "She knew," William said, his voice hollow. "All this time, she knew Margaret was our sister." James held Margaret as she swayed in her chair. "That's why she was so obsessed with destroying your family," he said. "It wasn't just about the evidence your father found. It was personal." Richard picked up the diary, reading further. "There's more. The night of the fire. She didn't just want to destroy the evidence, she wanted to hurt Helen by destroying her daughter's life. And then, when Helen started investigating years later, she killed her," William finished. "Killed our mother to keep this secret." Tommy looked up at his mother, his young face confused. "Mom, does this mean Mr. Harrington and Mr. Richard are really our uncles?" Margaret pulled her son close, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, sweetheart. It looks like our family just got bigger." Martha Stevens stood up, her face determined. "Helen knew. At the end, before the accident, she figured it out. That's why she was gathering all that evidence, not just to expose Vera's crimes, but to protect her daughter, to protect you, Margaret." William walked to the window, looking out at the town he'd come to care about so deeply. "All these years," he said softly, "I felt drawn to help your family. From that first night in the storm, it felt like more than chance." "Blood called to blood," Martha said. "Helen used to say that love finds a way even when we don't understand it." Just then, Detective Martinez returned with more news. Vera Patterson was just found in her cell. She left a confession. Everything, the corruption, the murder, all of it. She knew her empire was falling and she couldn't face what was coming. Margaret stood up, walking to stand beside William. In their faces, everyone could see it now. The same quiet strength, the same determination to fight for what was right. "What do we do now?" Richard asked. William turned to face them all. "We do what Mom would have wanted. We take everything Vera built through cruelty and greed, and we turn it into something good, together, as a family." 1 month later, the town gathered for a very different kind of meeting. The old community center, once controlled by Vera Patterson, had been transformed. A new sign hung over the door. The Helen McCarthy Harrington Foundation, helping families build their dreams. Margaret stood at the podium, her brothers beside her, her husband and children in the front row. The room was packed with families from all over the state, people whose lives had been touched by Vera's cruelty, now finding hope in the aftermath. My father taught me that standing up for what's right is never easy, Margaret said. My mother, my birth mother, proved that love is stronger than hate, and my family... She smiled at James and the children, then at William and Richard. My whole family has shown me that it's never too late for truth to come out, for healing to begin. Later that evening, they all gathered at the cottage, the original cottage, where it had all begun. The renovations were complete, but Margaret had insisted on keeping it their home. This is where our family's new story started, she'd said. As they sat around the dinner table, the Dawsons, the Harringtons, Martha Stevens, and even Sarah Miller, who'd become part of their extended family, William raised his glass. To Mom, he said softly. To both our mothers. They never got to see this day, but they made it possible. To family, Margaret added, the ones we're born to and the ones we choose. Outside, another storm was rolling in, but this time, as the thunder rumbled and the rain began to fall, no one was afraid, because they knew now that sometimes the biggest storms bring the greatest blessings. Sometimes they wash away the old to make room for something new and beautiful. And in that small town, in that humble cottage where a stranger had once knocked on a stormy night, a family that had been broken by secrets was finally whole again. The end. The summer sun shone down on the Helen McCarthy Harrington Foundation's first anniversary celebration. The town square was filled with families, music, and laughter, a far cry from the fear and silence that had ruled under Vera Patterson's reign. Margaret stood on the newly built gazebo, watching her extended family with joy in her heart. Tommy, now 13, was helping younger kids with the carnival games. Sarah, her pigtails bouncing, was organizing a group of children for face painting. Little Jack was following his Uncle William everywhere, fascinated by his fancy phone. Penny for your thoughts. James wrapped his arms around his wife from behind. Just thinking about how much has changed, Margaret said, leaning back against him. Look at William. Who would have thought the lonely businessman who showed up at our door that stormy night would become the fun uncle who sneaks our kids extra ice cream? Indeed, William had changed the most. Gone was the cold, isolated millionaire. He'd moved his company's headquarters to their town, focusing on building affordable housing and helping families achieve their dreams of home ownership. His latest project was converting Vera's mansion into a community center and shelter for families in need. Richard, too, had found his path. After serving community service for his role in Vera's schemes, he'd discovered a talent for teaching. Now he ran the foundation's financial literacy programs, helping people understand and manage their money. The jealousy that had poisoned his relationship with William was gone, replaced by genuine brotherhood. Martha Stevens had finally retired from being a secretary, but she hadn't slowed down. She ran the foundation's historical archives, making sure the truth about Vera's crimes and Helen McCarthy's courage would never be forgotten. Mom, Tommy came running up. Uncle William says he's going to teach me about business this summer. Can I intern at his office? Margaret smiled. As long as you keep your grades up. And speaking of grades, James added with a proud grin, show your mother what came in the mail. Tommy pulled out a letter. It was from the prestigious Madison Academy, a full scholarship. They said the essay I wrote about our family's story really impressed them. Sarah Miller, now the editor of the local newspaper, walked over with her own exciting news. The story is going national, she said. Not just Vera's crimes, but what you've all built afterward. People are calling it a blueprint for how communities can fight corruption and heal. But even in this moment of celebration, new challenges were brewing. William had noticed suspicious activity in some of the old property records, hints that Vera's network might have extended further than they knew. Richard had received a strange letter from someone claiming to have known their mother, and Margaret. Margaret had found another diary, this one belonging to her adoptive father, with entries that suggested he might have known more about her true parentage than he'd ever revealed. The Foundation's security chief, a former FBI agent who'd helped bring down Vera, approached William quietly. Sir, we've detected some unusual financial movements. Someone's trying to buy up properties again, using the same patterns Vera used to use. William's jaw tightened. Let me guess. Right where we're planning to build the new affordable housing complex? Yes, sir. And there's more, the money. It's coming from overseas accounts registered to someone named Patterson. Margaret overheard this and exchanged glances with her brothers. Could it be possible? Did Vera have family they didn't know about, or was someone else using her old methods? But those were concerns for another day. Today was for celebration, for family, for remembering how far they'd come. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town square, the extended Dawson-Harrington clan gathered for a family photo. Martha insisted on taking it in front of the foundation's new sign. "Your mothers would be so proud," she said, wiping away a tear. Both of them. Margaret looked at her children, her husband, her newfound brothers, and all the families whose lives they'd helped change. "They're still with us," she said softly. "In every kind deed, every truth revealed, every family helped." A warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of summer flowers. And if anyone had looked closely at the photograph Martha took that day, they might have noticed something strange. Two faint spots of light, like guardian angels, watching over their children who had finally found their way back to each other. But in the distance, storm clouds were gathering once again, because in this small town, as in life itself, every ending was just another beginning. And the next chapter of their story was already starting to unfold. This fall, return to the town where secrets run deep and family ties are tested by shocking new revelations. One mysterious letter changes everything. Richard Harrington sits, alone in his office, staring at a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting is hauntingly familiar. "Dear Richard, your mother Helen wasn't just my best friend. There's something she wanted you to know when the time was right. And now, after all these years, I have to break my promise to her." A father's secret diary reveals a devastating truth. Margaret finds herself reading her adoptive father's hidden journal by candlelight. "Today I saw her again, Vera's sister Victoria. She knows about Margaret's real parents. She's threatened to expose everything unless..." The pages end abruptly, torn away. What was her father trying to hide? A new threat emerges from the shadows. William confronts a sophisticated woman in an expensive suit at his office. Her smile is coldly familiar. "The Patterson name still means something in this town, Mr. Harrington. My dear Aunt Vera might be gone, but her vision lives on through me. Ancient wounds resurface." James discovers old photographs hidden in the cottage walls during renovations. In one, his father-in-law stands with a young Vera Patterson, both smiling, his arm around her waist. Sometimes, Martha Stevens warns, the people closest to us keep the biggest secrets. The next generation faces their own battles. Tommy Dawson, working at his Uncle William's office, accidentally opens a file he was never meant to see. "Dad," he says, his voice shaking, "I think I found out what really happened the night of the fire. And it wasn't Vera who started it." A stranger brings warning. A mysterious old man appears at the Foundation's anniversary gala. Helen McCarthy wasn't the only one who had to give up a child, he tells Margaret. "And your sister." "Yes, Margaret, you have a sister. She's been watching you all this time." Dark forces gather. The affordable housing project faces sudden opposition as anonymous buyers snap up properties throughout town. They're using Vera's old playbook, William realizes. But who would know those details unless family bonds are tested? Richard receives a USB drive in the mail. The video shows Helen McCarthy meeting secretly with Charles Patterson just 2 months before her death. "Everything you think you know about that night," a distorted voice says, "is a lie." And a shocking discovery changes everything. Margaret and William stand in a dusty attic, staring at an old painting. Behind it is a safe they've never seen before. Inside lies a single photograph and a letter that begins, "To my children, all 3 of you. If you're reading this, then the truth about that night has finally come out. But it's not the truth you think you know. Secrets never stay buried forever." This fall, join the Dawson-Harrington family as they face their greatest challenges. Yet, because some storms don't just threaten homes and fortunes, they threaten to tear families apart. The Storm and the Stranger, Legacy of Lies coming this September. In this town, Margaret says in the final scene, the biggest storms bring the greatest revelations, and this storm is just beginning.